Alawapa, dear friends. Welcome to the Sunday morning devotional program sponsored by the Spiritual Assemblies of the Baha'is of South DeKalb County and Sandy Springs, Georgia. It's wonderful to have all of you with us today. Across the globe, the teachings of the Baha'i faith, brought to us more than 150 years ago by His Holiness Baha'u'llah, its founder, whose name in Arabic means the glory of God, have inspired and continue to inspire individuals and communities as they strive to improve their own lives and contribute to the advancement of world civilization. Baha'i beliefs address such essential themes as the oneness of God and religion, the oneness of humanity and freedom from all forms of prejudice, the inherent nobility of the human being, the progressive revelation of religious truth, a gradual unfolding of God's purpose with the appearance of each divine teacher, the development of spiritual qualities, which allows us to reflect the image that God made us in, the integration of worship and service, such that work performed in the spirit of service is actually accorded as worship in the eyes of God, the fundamental equality of the sexes, more widely evidenced in a setting of equal opportunity, the harmony between religion and science as an established fact, the centrality of justice in all human endeavor, the importance of education, particularly for children, and the dynamics of the relationships that bind together individuals, communities, and institutions as humanity advances towards its collective maturity. Again, welcome. We're pleased to have you all with us today, and we'll begin with opening devotions. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and silence your electronic devices if you are speaking. Thank you very much. Done, team?
O Lord, thou art the remover of every anguish and the dispeller of every affliction. Thou art he who banished every sorrow and set free every slave, the Redeemer of every soul. O Lord, grant deliverance through thy mercy, and reckon me among such servants of thine as having gained salvation.
Kathy?
O Lord, provide for the speedy growth of the tree of thy divine unity. Water it then, O Lord, with the flowing waters of thy good pleasure, and cause it before the revelations of thy divine assurance to yield such fruits as thou desirest for thy glorification and exaltation, thy praise and thanksgiving, and to magnify thy name, to laud the oneness of thine essence, and to offer adoration unto thee, inasmuch as all this lieth within thy grasp, and in that of none other. Great is the blessedness of those whose blood thou hast chosen wherewith to water the tree of thine affirmation, and thus to exalt thy holy and immutable word. The Bab.
My own?
I'm sorry, did you ask me?
Yes, Hermione, if you could.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Glorified art thou, O Lord my God. I beseech thee by him who is thy most great name, who hath been sorely afflicted by such of thy creatures as have repudiated thy truth, and who hath been hemmed in by sorrows, which no tongue can describe, to grant that I may remember thee and celebrate thy praise in these days when all have turned away from thy beauty, have disputed with thee, and turned away disdainfully from him who is the revealer of thy cause. None is there, O my Lord, to help thee except thine own self, and no power to succor thee, save thine own power. I entreat thee to enable me to cleave steadfastly to thy love and thy remembrance. This is verily within my power, and thou art the one that knoweth all that is in me. Thou in truth art knowing, apprised of all. Deprive me not, O my Lord, of the splendors of the light of thy face, whose brightness hath illuminated the whole world. No God is there beside thee, the most powerful, the all-glorious, the ever-forgiving. Baha'u'llah.
Gwen.
I have wakened in thy shelter, O my God, and it becometh him that seeketh that shelter to abide within the sanctuary of thy protection and the stronghold of thy defense. Illumine my inner being, O my Lord, with the splendors of the day spring of thy revelation, even as thou didst illumine my outer being with the morning light of thy favor.
Barbara.
Thou compassionate Lord, thou who art generous and able, we are servants of thine, sheltered beneath thy providence. Cast thy glance of favor upon us. Give light to our eyes, hearing to our ears, and understanding and love to our hearts. Render our souls joyous and happy through thy glad tidings. O Lord, point out to us the pathway of thy kingdom, and resuscitate all of us through the breaths of the Holy Spirit. Bestow upon us life everlasting, and confer upon us never-ending honor. Unify mankind and illumine the world of humanity. May we all follow thy pathway, long for thy good pleasure, and seek the mysteries of thy kingdom. O God, unite us and connect our hearts with thy indissoluble bond. Verily thou art the giver, thou art the kind one, and thou art the Almighty. Abdul Baha.
Dorothy.
I'm sorry. Oh, my brother, hearken to the delightsome words of my honeyed tongue, and quaff the stream of my mystic holiness from my sugar-shedding lips. Sow the seeds of my divine wisdom in the pure soil of thy heart, and water them with the water of certitude, that the hyacinths of my knowledge and wisdom may spring up fresh and green in the sacred city of thy heart. Baha'u'llah.
Matthew.
This is the day in which the testimony of the Lord hath been fulfilled, the day in which the word of God hath been made manifest, and his evidence firmly established. His voice is calling you unto that which shall profit you, and enjoineth you to observe that which shall draw you nigh unto God, the Lord of creation. Baha'u'llah.
My object is none other than the betterment of the world and the tranquility of its peoples. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. This unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels which the pen of the Most High hath revealed are suffered to pass unheeded. Through the power of the words he hath uttered, the whole of the human race can be illumined with the light of unity, and the remembrance of his name is able to set on fire the hearts of all men and burn away the veils that intervene between them and his glory. Kathy?
Be thou not sad and dispirited on account of the opposition of the heedless ones. Soon they shall regret sorely. Reflect thou how the Pharisees persecuted and looked down in contempt upon his holiness, the Christ. The result was that his lamp became ignited, his light began to shine, and his followers sparkled like unto the stars from the horizon of existence. And the consequences to the Pharisees was the pangs of remorse and regrets. Abdul Baha.
Thank you to all today's readers. Next, we're going to listen to a healing prayer. If any of you wish to remember a loved one through this prayer for healing, please feel free to call out their name at this time.
The people of Florence, South Carolina.
Josie Reynolds,
Andy Maslowski,
Jackson family.
Mary Eaton.
That's you.
Dear souls in Haiti.
That's you.
Yes.
That's you. That's you.
United States.
That's you. That's you.
Thy name is my healing. Thy name is my companion. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Thy name is my healing. Thy name is my healing, oh my God.
And now we're blessed to have a musical offering.
When times get rough and my soul has lost its fire, I turn to God, my adored one, my desire. And when times are dark and my candle has lost its flame, I turn to God and call His name. My God, my adored one, my King, my desire. What tongue can voice my thanks? Voice my thanks to Thee. My God, my adored one, my King,
All right. Let's see. Good. We're all ready then. Friends, each week we are blessed to have a guest speaker share with us their insights on a particular topic. This week, we're honored to have with us Burton Smith. Burton Smith was born in Lansing, Michigan, sorry about that, the second son of Baha'i parents William and Eva Smith. He declared his belief in Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i cause in 1971 at Llewellyn Baha'i School, now Llewellyn Center for Higher Learning. He graduated from Princeton with a degree in civil and geological engineering in 1977. While at Princeton, he was a co-founder of the Princeton Baha'i Club with Michigan native Jay Tyson and Bill Foster as the faculty staff advisor, founding member of the Princeton University Jazz Ensemble, playing acoustic and electric bass, the first person of African descent to medal for the Princeton golf team at the Harvard-Yale Princeton match, and a member of the two-time Ivy League championship team. He was one of 32 members of the Baha'i Black Men's Gathering who traveled to Ghana and Haifa in December 2006, and he retired from the state of Michigan as a staff specialist in 2010. He sang with Tom Price and Ben Gilmer at Carnegie Hall and Nashville's Ryman Auditorium, and has participated in the Baha'i choral festivals at the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette, Illinois, since their inception in 2007. Since retiring, he has researched the lost history of Lansing, Michigan. In addition to today's presentation, he has spoken on the following topics: the 90th anniversary celebration of the Baha'i faith in Lansing, Michigan, the history of the Baha'i faith in Lansing, Michigan, 1912 to 1975, Louis G. Gregory in Michigan, an independent search and investigation, the crash, connections of an 80-year history on the lives of 6 AA residents in Lansing. Burton lives in Lansing, Michigan with Denise, his wife of 33 years. Their son Brandon lives and works in Chicago doing contract work for a video gaming company. Friends, please welcome Burton Smith.
Thank you, Stephen, and Laupan. Good morning, everyone. I'm so proud and pleased and honored to be here. I'd like to thank everyone that invited me, even if it was on short notice. And I wanted to make sure that everyone knew of all the things that happened today, that tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of David Earle's ascension. He passed away August 23rd, 1996 in Scottsville, Michigan, and his body was flown from Scottsville to Ann Arbor so it could be interred next to his lovely wife, Joy. So let me see if I can make this work. Hold on. Okay. Share my screen. Yes. Share sound. Optimize for video. Okay. Share. Okay, can everybody see that? I hope so. Okay. Works for me.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So this is essentially the travel teaching timeline for Louis Gregory with David and Joy Earle in Lansing, Michigan. The chronology is as of August 2021. We are working on that specifically to make sure that we've got everything as up to date as possible. So let's go. All right. Okay. Let's see. I always try to start with a quote from Baha'u'llah. I'm pretty sure that everyone remembers this one. If you be aware of a truth, if you possess a jewel of which others are deprived, share it with them in a language of utmost kindliness and goodwill. This is Al the Baha'i in 1912. This is him talking specifically about interracial marriage with Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew. Louisa Matthew was 8 years his senior, and they were married in New York City in September of 1912. This is Louis Gregory giving a talk specifically. I am currently researching as to whether or not he did speak up in Idlewild, Michigan in 1924. I believe he did, but since they're closed, I won't be able to access the records until 2022. This is the Helen Whitney letter. This was a letter written by Helen Whitney, who became Helen Eggleston of the Llewellyn Baha'i School, now Llewellyn Center for Higher Learning. The important part of the letter is the fact that it documents that Louis Gregory did come to Lansing. And when I saw it in archives, I broke down and cried, because I had never in my life had heard that Louis Gregory was ever in Lansing. And since I grew up here, I thought that that was kind of something that was relatively important to a Baha'i, particularly a Baha'i of African descent, particularly a Baha'i that's a product of an interracial marriage. This is a week after Louis Gregory was in Lansing. This is the local spiritual assembly of Lansing, meeting with Corinne True, who was in the center of the photograph in all black. Helen Eggleston is the young woman in front of her, as said, and Bertha Hyde Kirkpatrick is over here. These are members of the LSA, but there wasn't any kind of formal meeting with Louis Gregory and the Lansing LSA, even though he was just as much a member of the National Spiritual Assembly as Corinne True was. This is David Earl and Joy Hill's marriage license, June 19th, 1933, Westfield, New York. Now, the reason that this is important specifically is because of the fact, if you'll notice, that David Earl and Joy Earl are both listed as being white. Now, that is probably due to the miscegenation laws at the time, but it's also a point to note that it was a day before David Earl graduated from Oberlin College. This is on behalf of those who are suffering in Haiti. This was Shoki Effendi writing. This is Louis Gregory and Louisa Gregory in Haiti in 1936. This is David Earl's manifest, him coming back as a 13-year-old in New York City. For those of you that don't know, David Earl spent the part of his life from 1919 when he was 8 to 1925 when he was 13 overseas, particularly in India. His family took a boat from San Francisco to Yokohama, and then took another boat from Yokohama to Hong Kong, then took another boat from Hong Kong to India, in which case they took a train to, their final destination of Lahore, which was in India, but is now in Pakistan. This is David and Joy Earl, at the Llewellyn Ranch in 1938. They're the first interracial couple to attend Llewellyn, and this picture was probably taken by Helen Eggleston. This is David and Joy Earl's first house in Lansing. They moved there in April of 1938, and in May of 1938, Joy gave a phone interview. She talked specifically about what her likes were. They were horseback riding, calligraphy, and painting. This is David Earl teaching Esperanto at the Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, Michigan, November 29th of 1938. This is Joy Earl speaking in Lansing about interracial amity. This is Sunday evening, December 3rd, 1938. The participants along with her were Josephine Tinsley, Jewel Allen, as well as Herbert B. Johnson. Herbert B. Johnson played violin. I'm still looking for a picture of Herbert B. Johnson. This is the North Presbyterian Church. This is on the list of historical places in Lansing, and this is where Joy Earl gave her first speaking engagement on interracial amity. The next week, Joy Earl basically reruns the same program, but at a different church. This church is the Seymour Avenue Methodist Church. This, as you can see, the musical program we presented by three colored musicians, Josephine Tinsley, Herbert Johnson, and Jewel Allen. Notice how Joy Earl is still listed as Mrs. David Earl. This is the Seymour Avenue Methodist Church. Excuse me, let me go back and show that again. It's also an incubator now, so there aren't any services to go in, whereas the previous church that says they are still holding services. This is the Advent of Divine Justice, which was released December 25th, 1938, which was 2 weeks after Joy Earl gave her speaking engagement on interracial amity, the second one. So Joy Earl actually gave two speaking engagements about interracial amity in Lansing, Michigan, prior to the release of the Advent of Divine Justice. Now, in 1939, we've got Reverend T.G.R. Brownlow of the Mount Hope Avenue Methodist Church allowing Joy Earl to speak in the evening, and specifically talking with Josephine Tinsley, with Herbert Johnson, and it says, and those were the two that were actually performing along with Joy Earl, who gave accompaniments. She was a graduate in piano conservatory at Oberlin. This is the Mount Hope Avenue Methodist Church, still here in Lansing, still holding congregation services. February 25th, this is Joy Earl at the Church of the Redeemer. It says this particular church was Reverend Jarrett's church. This is on the north side of Lansing, was on the north side of Lansing. It was demolished and replaced by Bethlehem Temple Church, which is now being demolished and is becoming another incubator here in Lansing. So this church existed until the 1940s, and then it was torn down and replaced by another church. This is David Earl talking about Esperanto classes at Sparrow Hospital, the nurse's residence. This is Joy Earl at the First Presbyterian Church. This is the church that was across the street from the state capitol. This was the First Presbyterian Church. The second one was actually built on the site where Martha Root had spoken back in 1923. But that new church was built in 1951. This church was there in 1939, and this is First Presbyterian. And this is Dr. Peter Monsma, who was known for actually bringing his sermons outside of the church and onto the state capitol lawn. Someone asked me, well, how are you sure that it was across the street from the state capitol? Well, it turns out that I found this photograph, which shows a person on the side of Capitol Avenue. It shows the spire of the Presbyterian Church next to the state capitol. So that was my confirmation. Now, Joy Earl led a sextet at the first International Friendship Dinner at the YWCA here in Lansing, Michigan, on Tuesday, April 25th, 1939. Now, this was consistent with her practices of, it says, forming interracial, international gatherings wherever she spoke. And this is Joy Earl. This is a picture that was taken of her at New Helen. And this is the sextet. I have 4 of the 6 members, and so in deference, I won't show the 4. But Josephine Tinsley spoke and sang at each one of Joy Earl's speaking engagements, and she lived to be 101. Her sister was Fanny Eaton, Gertrude Jackson, Jewel Allen, Charles' husband, who was a professional singer, as well as Jewel Allen and Lewis Brown. Joy Earl spoke at the interracial program sponsored by the Women's Club at the African Methodist Church in Lansing in May 1939. I've asked the African Methodist Episcopal Church for any records. To this date, they have not come up with any, but they do recognize the fact that, yes, they are the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which is now Trinity African Methodist Episcopalian here in Lansing, about 3 blocks away from where I'm sitting. David Earl wrote his note to Sister Barbara Babbs that says, inside Stanwood Cobb's book, Character. This is dated May 31st, 1939. This is the documentation of Joy Earl speaking in Lansing as a Baha'i. This stands out in the fact that it still says Mrs. David Earl, the subject being the New Age, and Joy Earl at this particular time was a resident of Lansing, and she conducted this class according to records that the YWCA had. I think there were 6 people there, but I haven't confirmed that as of yet. This is the YWCA, which was built in 1905, but torn down in 2002. But we'll come back to that because this also has a specific place in Lansing's teaching history. This is where David and Joy Earl moved to in Lansing in 1939, the latter part of 1939. Joy Earl was pregnant at the time, and this house was on the east side of Lansing, the very eastern edge of Lansing, away from the section where they had lived previously. This is a quote from The Advent of Divine Justice. This is in the conflict of this twofold crusade. The valiant warrior struggling in the name and for the cause of Baha'u'llah must of necessity encounter stiff resistance and suffer many a setback. Because of Abdu'l-Baha, the beloved master has prophesied, many a test will be visited upon you, troubles will befall you, and suffering afflict you. And so this is the documentation of the tragedy that happened here in Lansing. We had mentioned whether or not there were newspaper accounts of David and Joy Earl moving to that location, but personal accounts of the activities were not able to be confirmed to any written accounts, but the Earl family members did indeed confirm that this happened. So in the spring of 1940, David and Joy Earl were confronted at their home by the local members of the Black Legion, a virulent white supremacist group affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan. This group included people who may have been responsible for the brutal murder of Reverend Earl Little, Malcolm X's father in Lansing back in 1931. You can read that in the autobiography of Malcolm X. The activity of the Black Legion at the Earl's residence caused the young Joy Earl to go into shock, which led to the loss of their only child. The boy, is interred in the Children's Garden section of the Deepdale Cemetery here in Lansing, the west side. The grave marker in the Children's Garden reads, the Deepdale Cemetery record lists the Earl child was stillborn, but the grave marker in the Children's Garden reads, this grave marker is closer to my house and to me than my parents, and they're only a quarter mile away. As it says, Earl our little Bobby, April 15th, 1940, a trust from me. Now, in my independent investigation of this, it came up as a side to what I was actually doing at the time. So it turns out that my babysitter grew up here in Lansing, and while I was researching, she informed me, when I was talking specifically to her in Scottville, that David Earl would come to Lansing and say prayers at the gravesite of their son. This has been hidden in plain sight, forgotten by generations. The Baha'i World in Memoriam lists David Earl is buried next to his wife Joy, and their infant son was located in the Washtenaw Memorial Gardens. Well, their son is actually here in Lansing, but we'll get to that. David Earl was buried next to his wife Joy and their infant son in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So the Earl's third home in Lansing was from 624 to 312 Home Street. Now, archives in Wilmette list their address as Detroit. The census lists their address as Detroit. Everything about the Earls was listed as Detroit due to the fallout of them being targeted by the Black Legion. So, the smaller home was near Sparrow Hospital. The directory shows them as living there. We understand that David and Joy rented the place, but they were there quite frequently. And the home ownership card and is signed by David Earl. This is the home. It has since been torn down due to the expansion of the hospital. And this is David M. Earl's signature at the top in 1941 as being a tenant at 312 North Holmes. They weren't allowed to buy it for obvious reasons, specifically because Joy was a person of color. Joy did not wind up. This is the local laws did not allow them to purchase this place, so they rented it. Louis Gregory comes back to Lansing in 1942, January of 1942. This is the actual written account in the Lansing State Journal. It talks about him talking about the destiny of America. It's at the YWCA, the picture that you saw previously. So the public is invited to attend the lecture given under auspices of the Lansing Baha'i Group. There were at least 30 people in attendance. 9 days later, Joy Earl gives a talk on world brotherhood at the Michigan Methodist Church here in Lansing. Now, this is 9 days afterward. I have not been able to determine whether or not Joy, as Louis Gregory, was in attendance. My understanding is that he had already left Lansing, but that David and Joy Earl were at Louis Gregory's talk there at the YWCA in January of 1942. So both of them were there. This is the Michigan Methodist Church. It was torn down in the mid-60s, and its location is currently also a parking lot. This is Joy Earl, and this is the voice of Dr. Jessalyn Ingram being Joy Earl.
Seeing this, you can imagine why people always took me for Japanese. Davy was in the Navy Japanese language school in Boulder.
This is David and Joy Earl, along with Louis Gregory, and in between Joy Earl and Louis Gregory is Marcia Gale, who was the daughter of Ali Kuli Khan. This picture was taken at the 1944 Baha'i Centennial Banquet at the Stevens Hotel Grand Ballroom in Chicago, Illinois. This was May 25th, 1944. This is the documentation that I had been waiting for a year with respect to finding that David and Joy did, in fact, both know Louis Gregory, as well as Marcia Gale. This is David Earl receiving a Christmas gift from his father in 1944. David Earl is serving in the Navy. He's serving as basically a code as his breaker because of his knowledge of languages in Japanese. This is his father basically saying, I still want you to be a preacher. And if you're ever ready, you can come back to Christianity. He chose not to. So Joy Earl in 1946, her speaking tour cities were these. Joy Earl documents all of this. She says specifically about the places that she went to. She talks how many people were there. She talks positively about every case, almost specifically dealing with the people who had invited her into their homes, such as Mr. and Mrs. Nine there in Dayton. Notice that the Dorothy Baker's home was the Baha'i Center in Lima, Ohio. The Baha'i Center in Philadelphia, I understand, still is in existence. Nashville, she speaks at Fisk University. Jackson, Mississippi, she's at the Negro Chamber of Commerce. And Birmingham, Alabama, she's at the Baha'i Center. It's a nice attendance. And she stayed at the same place during that time period she was there as actor, orator, and singer Paul Robeson and his wife. That was news to me. And she writes this all from her account at Albany State College, where she also spoke. I haven't been able to get those records yet. She says, Miami and Atlanta are planning race unity meetings. Jacksonville is as well. What is important to note here is that both Louisville, Kentucky, and Memphis, Tennessee did not respond to the efforts of the teaching committee at the time. And you can, this is their histories of difficulties with the Baha'i faith are well documented. Oberlin College graduate Joy Earl. This is specific about what she talked about and said that she did firesides as well. These are the notable quotes that Joy Earl spoke about in the 1940s. Before people can come together without harm physically, they must come together spiritually. And then in a separate, this is speaking engagement, she said, race is a problem which is planetary in scope. This is David Earl speaking, as it's in Florida, from his teaching Esperanto. This is David Earl speaking in Lansing after the war is over, talking specifically about democracy without politics. That's the newspaper article on the right. And the search for faith was his first fireside back in Lansing at the home of Mr. and Mrs. W. Kenneth Christian on Genesee Street. This is the first Baha'i wedding in Lansing. David Earl was the head witness and bridesman for this event. This is the location. This was the women's clubhouse. This is Michael and Margaret Jameer, who got married. This is there. Michael was a social worker, and this is Margaret was a nurse as well as a teacher. And the school that she taught at, I also attended 12, 13 years later. This is Louis Gregory's letter to Joy and David Earl. This is the Uncle Louis letter. This is a letter where he specifically congratulates them on being selected to come to Greenacre, and this is work and deepened studies there. I've read this before, but essentially the most important piece was at the end where he says, lovingly, Uncle Louis, confirming what Richard and Gwen wrote about in Lights of the Spirit, is that it says he was referred to as Uncle Louis. Now, North Brother Island is where Joy and David Earl lived in 1950, 1951. North Brother Island still exists today. North Brother Island is abandoned and has been abandoned for over 50 years. But they did wind up living there. And that was while David was studying for his PhD in law and government at Columbia. Joy was helping Juliet Thompson, yes, that Juliet Thompson, with firesides and serving on the LSA of the Baha'is of New York City. Joy Earl gave public talks in Ridgewood, at Teaneck, at the Evergreen Cabin, or the Roy Wilhelm properties, in Brattleboro, Vermont, at a local address, in Rochester, New York. These are all holy days where she spoke. This is the prayer book of Hand of the Cause of God, Louis Gregory, which we found in Baha'i archives. I asked whether or not I could hold it. They said yes. I asked whether or not I could open it. They said yes. And out of pure reverence, I opened it just to the first page. And this is the first, this is prayer, which is said in Louis Gregory's handwriting at the top. It says, prayer revealed by Baha'u'llah. We've seen this recently a lot in specific discussions and consultation about Baha'is. And this was part of the advent of divine justice, which was always spoken about, but I'm going to read it now specifically because of it's how I think Baha'is are supposed to look at each other, even though this was written in 1938. So freedom from racial prejudice in any of its forms should, at such a time as this, when an increasingly large section of the human race is falling a victim to its devastating ferocity, be adopted as the watchword of the entire body of the American believers, in whichever state they reside, in whatever circles they move, whatever their age, traditions, tastes, and habits. It should be consistently demonstrated in every phase of their activity in life, whether in the Baha'i community or outside it, in public or in private, formally as well as informally, individually as well as their official capacity as organized groups, committees, and assemblies. It should be deliberately cultivated through the various and everyday opportunities, no matter how insignificant, that present themselves, whether in their homes, their business offices, their schools and colleges, their social parties and recreation grounds, their Baha'i meetings, conferences, conventions, summer schools, and assemblies. Basically, that's all the time. And I've got this listing of, it says David Earl, as he's written his letter to his sister. And this voice is Dr. Ned Walker.
January 30th, 1952. Dear Babs, it seems wonderful to be getting a letter off to you only 4 months after you wrote to me. That's much better than I usually do, I am sure. However, I have good reason to write, as we are just about ready to start out for Japan. I guess I told you I had finished everything on my PhD except the dissertation. Orals were last May, and have been researching full-time ever since June. I have been exploring every possibility of getting to Japan for a year of study, as I have to use so much Japanese language material, and it would be a lot easier if I were surrounded by the language all the time instead of just seeing it in books. Also, of course, I can get some materials there which aren't available here, such as 19th century periodicals, etc. But nothing seemed to come through, and I had just about decided to go to work again and earn some money, since my VA entitlement expires this spring, when all of a sudden I received an offer to teach 2 years at Meiji University in Tokyo. The salary is barely a subsistence wage by American standards, but it is extremely generous by theirs. So I feel very grateful that they had made me such a fine offer. Not only will they pay me the same rate as their regular full professors, 20,000 yen a month, 12 times a year, but they will only expect me to teach 8 or 10 hours a week, so as to have time to complete my dissertation in the 2-year period. Also, they will help guide my research. All that when I don't yet have my PhD. It is really a wonderful opportunity, and I am delighted with it. I will be ready for the defense of the dissertation as soon as I return in the summer of 1954, so that when I receive the degree, I will already have 2 years of experience teaching political science in a Japanese university. Thus, I will have a much better chance of getting a teaching job I will like in some American university, as I will be more definitely specialized. Of course, we want to see you, Bill, and the children before we go. We will be in Detroit for a few days in the second half of February. I wonder if you could take time to send me a postcard to tell me what is the best way to get in touch with you. If you have a phone, I'll call from Detroit and we can make arrangement. Or if not, perhaps I could call Bill at Wayne if he has office hours there. Give me whatever instructions I need and I will follow them. We enjoyed your letter, also pictures of children and a Christmas card with the plate number attached to the stamp. Very nice. I heard from Mother that you got to Holt all right, and that Greg did a fine job of snow shoveling. See you soon.
Dr. Walker was one of the people that met David Earl as a young student at Llewellyn. This is the location where David Earl spoke in 1947, but this is 1952, and this is the home of William Kenneth Christian and his wife Roberta and their son Roger. William Kenneth Christian was the person, for those of you who have your copy of Gleanings handy, he wrote the introduction, and it's dated 1952, and this is where he lived. and the door that's on the left side, 1001 Genesee Street, here in Lansing, Michigan. Joy Earl, after traveling to Japan with her husband, came back from Japan to America just in time for the dedication of the Baha'i House of Worship. She came on the Flying Cloud. She came, it was a 17-day trip, and it lists her name, her age, her citizenship, her luggage. She had 5 suitcases, 1 foot locker, and 1 package. Note that her address is listed as 2285 Cedar Street, Holt, Michigan. That was actually the address of her father and mother-in-law. And that's the address that David spoke about in the letter, the Holt address. So this is Joy Earl in an African-American newspaper talking specifically about teaching in Japan. It's such a nice picture of her. I decided to keep that as part of my cameo. So this is David and Joy Earl listed after, and it says their trips to, Japan and back in the States. But there are a number of photographs, and I could basically spend, the rest of the time and then some, letting you see them. So Joy Earl's last speaking engagement in Lansing was January 1971. She spoke in a panel, World Religion Day, and she is still listed, of all things, as Mrs. David Earl. Now, Joy Earl's last letter that she wrote in Japan was found earlier, as a year ago, among the archives at Llewellyn. And it was written, dated September 27th, 1972. She wrote a short letter. And it says she gave, this is a look in their scheduled plans, and said when she was coming home. So let's see if I have that copy. Yes, I have Jesselyn reading that.
September 27th, 1972. My dear Vi, we were so happy that you have decided after all to travel. I'm sure there was a large hole in your life when the school bells rang and you didn't respond. After much going to and fro, we have finally gotten settled in a small apartment in Kyoto, which seemed to offer the best space for David's research. He is now anxious to get on with it, and we have worked out a schedule which assumes he can finish his work by November 1st at the very latest. We will then go to Korea for a week, come back to Japan and rest at a hot spring hotel on Shimoda, and go back to Tokyo on November 21st and leave for Honolulu on the 25th. We will stay a week or so in Hawaii and then head for home. Now, fire off a letter to us and say when you'll be coming. I'm so sorry that I haven't written sooner, but I've been ailing ever since I drank bad water in India. It was made worse by the pace we had to go at to meet the believers all over Malaya and Singapore. What a thrill. I've just had enough energy to meet my Baha'i obligations and get back into bed. I'm going to spend a few days at the Mogahilo because Maheen is taking me shopping for warm clothes. Come. Love, Joy.
Joy Earl leaves this world 2 months after this letter is written. She leaves this world in Michigan. She never got better. There are a number of accolades that I could say at this particular point about Joy. The one in particular that I will say is that I met her as a junior youth at Llewellyn when she introduced Stanwood Cobb. She came all the way from her home in Ann Arbor This is to introduce him as well as be with him that afternoon. This is Joy Earl's grave marker in Washtenaw Memorial Gardens, just north of Ann Arbor. This is Dr. David McGarry Earl. David Earl obviously has established a precedent when he decided to marry Joy against the particular laws at the time. And for those of you that are asking, was Joy Earl Baha'i in Lansing? She spoke about Baha'i things in Lansing, but unfortunately, though David was the vice chair of the Lansing Local Spiritual Assembly, Lansing did not choose to honor her declaration. Instead, her declaration was honored in Detroit in January of 1940. So that's the first record of Joy Earl being a Baha'i, whereas David was a Baha'i declared in 1936. This is David Earl's grave marker next to Joy's. And you'll notice real closely, this is his ascension date, says August 23rd, 1996. So this coming Friday, there's actually a art exhibition by David Earl's sister, Barbara Earl Thompson, who we call Babs, and their daughters, Maggie and Sarah. Barbara's daughters, Maggie and Sarah, will be present there. She left this world on July 25th, 2 weeks shy of her 98th birthday. She was so glad that I was doing this work involving her brother, because that's her brother and her there in India on the left. And that's her also, as it's in India on the right. So I usually add the fact that the three of them, although they were never present in this world together, I always like to put their grave markers together. And this is David. It appears as though he is trimming Joy's nails at the home of David's parents in Holt. I like this picture because I think it evinces true love just about as much as anything I've seen. So Joy basically talked about the three onenesses when she was here. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for attending and watching. Now, gladly entertain any questions if you have some.
Yes, at this time, if anyone has a question, please feel free to ask. So.
Nothing about how David and Joy first met each other?
I don't have a question, but just a comment. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing, a Black woman Baha'i. I know we have Lewis Gregory and we have Robert Abbott and we have lots of the male Black Baha'is, but I like to hear about the female Black Baha'is and what get in their head and kind of what their world was like. And it's, great, just fruitful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I was helped in some aspects of this by Joy Earl's first cousin was Mary Hill, who married Bill Maxwell, who's still living at the tender age of 92, 93 in Arkansas. And so he helped me specifically because I said, I'm doing something on Joy and David Earl. And he said, well, I was an arranged marriage, and it was arranged by Joy Earl because I was ready to go back from Korea to the United States. And Joy said, before you do, there's someone I'd like you to meet. And so Joy arranged for her first cousin Mary to meet Bill at the Tokyo Baha'i Center, and they were married 1 year later.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
That actually connects to a sort of question I had. As someone who has spent a lot of time living and traveling in Asia, I couldn't help but be curious about the sorts of activities they were involved in when they spent all their time, in Asia and in so many parts of Asia, no less. It's remarkable, actually.
yeah, I didn't mention this, but it's a point of fact that David Earl is listed in the rare book section because he was responsible for translating Baha'u'llah and the New Era from English to Japanese in 1954. That was one of his first assignments. It took him about a year. I've got him listed on the interview. I don't play it normally because the Earl family says, it's just take it references from that. But yes, he and, as he said, Mr. Hungo were responsible for translating Baha'u'llah and the New Era from English to Japanese. That was one of his very first things that he did with the guidance of Agnes Alexander. So
It's quite remarkable. My family and I were, just before the pandemic began, in February of last year, we were in Tokyo on what was meant to be a vacation, but became an enforced exile to America from our home in China. And we got to visit the Tokyo Baha'i Center and meet some of the Baha'is there while we were visiting. And a wonderful place. And I didn't know any of the history, to be honest. Still don't know very much of history of the Baha'i faith there. So, but it's intriguing to see there's a connection back to the U.S. in this way. So,
and another strangely point of serendipity is that I think Bill and Nancy Barnes are there in Tokyo, and I believe that they were married here in Lansing in 1969, and David Earl came and gave a fireside at their home, and their home is still here on the, it's at the outskirts of right next to the parking lot for all the Oldsmobile vehicles, for General Motors vehicles, I should say, because Cadillacs and Camaros are made here. And I asked Bill and Nancy whether or not they have a photograph, and they said, I think we do, but I can't find it right now because we're in Japan. And I'm like, okay, well, when you get around to it, it'd be nice to see. And he said, well, I can still see him there sitting in that nice chair in front of the front door, giving a fireside. And I said, yeah, I can too. I just would love it if someone would wind up being able to share photographs of David and Joy here in Lansing. And I know that since David was the master of ceremonies at that first Baha'i wedding, that there is likely a photograph of him and of Joy in the wedding guests and all of the other things that happened over 70 years ago. And it just so happens that Michael and Margaret Jameer's son-in-law is Stephen Collins, who is the noted historian. And so every time I see Stephen on Thursday, I say, about that wedding guest list. And he's always shaking his head and saying, we're getting to it. So I said, well, it'd be nice if you found it sometime, because, people from Japan have seen some of the work that I've done, and they want me to come over to Japan, and they would like me to, extend the 10 to 12 year history of David and Joy in Japan. And I said, that's a 10-year project, and I'm still working on book 1. Thank you very much. But that's book 2. And that's kind of the one that I've handed to Bill and Nancy Barnes and say, while you're there, why don't you consider doing book 2? And so book 3 is essentially David Earl pioneering to Palau and Guam after Joy's passing. And a lot of people have asked me, well, how come you haven't talked about Palau and Guam? And I've said, because I'm still too busy working on David and Joy here in Lansing, as well as David and Joy here in the US before all of that happened. So surely somebody's got one more question. I mean,
Mr. Smith,
yes.
thank you very much for your very comprehensive presentation. I just wondered, they were a biracial couple, so did they encounter any difficulties while in Asia, in that respect as they would have experienced in the United States?
I think because both of them spoke Japanese, I think that helped tremendously with respect to Joy actually being able to answer the phone in Japanese, converse in Japanese and say, you know, please come over. And people would come over and they would expect a person that was Asian answering the door. And when Joy opened the door, you can imagine the shock of people looking at her and saying, oh. And so she said, you know, please come in. I mean, there are a number of people who have had stories about how Joy was able to speak to them and touch their hearts, particularly in the fireside mode. I think she got that from Juliet Thompson. And in fact, I'm certain of it, because there are people today that still say that when they listen to Joy Earl or remember her speaking on how she made them feel like they were in the room when she did a piece on the Declaration of the Baha'i, she was so calm and so erudite. One person said, I just could not believe how she had memorized all of these long passages from the writings. It's almost as if she could just, like on command and on cue, go to a specific section of Gleanings, go to a specific section of the Advent of Divine Justice, go to whatever it was that was necessary. And in the her diary or her notes that she writes, she says specifically, I don't know on this, but I'm going to trust in Baha'u'llah. And I think that that's where we as Baha'i teachers kind of need to lean ourselves towards. And that's what Louis Gregory kind of told Dorothy Baker at Greenacre, that's in from Cockermouth, about that specific experience. But getting back to your question, I think because they knew the language, there was less of animosity that was shown to them. I'm sure that there was some, and Professor Maxwell says that there was some to a degree, but because he was a professor and that he spoke Japanese, I think there was a level of respect that was given to him that may not have necessarily been given to someone who did not speak the language, who was not familiar with the customs. And he was very familiar, you know, and make no mistake, I've got pictures of them in kimonos. I've got pictures of them all up and down Japan, wherever it was that they spoke. And like I said, Joy Earl's, one of her finest moments that she can remember is the fact that they gave her a going away celebration at Tokyo. And these were the people that she had first met earlier, like 12 years earlier, that weren't Baha'is, that were seekers, that had become Baha'is. And so they were so grateful to her. And I think one is, and this is part of the chapter of the book I'm writing, is entitled The Black Rose, is that one was a very good calligrapher painter, and she painted a black rose for Joy. And she said, well, roses are usually red. She goes, he says, yes, but you are my black rose.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the power of Baha'u'llah played a significant role.
Yes, I can tell you specifically that everyone who has spoken to Joy or knew Joy Earl, or it's in her presence or was in David's presence, remembers them fondly. And a lot had to do with the fact of what, you know, I didn't speak about what their time at Oberlin was when they were actually separate but married. And then when Oberlin found out that they were married, they chose not to give David Earl his graduate degree in political science. In fact, they kicked him out of the university and told him, in effect, don't come back. So at the 50-year anniversary of his graduation in 1983, he writes, all I've ever achieved in my life is not due to, and it says, is in spite of Oberlin, not because of it. essentially what had happened to them. And he had gone back 10, 12 years later, trying to get Oberlin to recognize the fact that, yes, he had enough credits for a master's degree, but because it was an interracial marriage, because there were miscegenation laws at the time, because there were rights, rules, responsibilities of collegiate students at the time, that they were not supposed to do things. So basically, David Earl violated that. And that was enough for them to expel. That was enough for them, because as far as they were concerned, that since he did not tell them the truth, he lied to them. That's essentially what it was. It was that he never told them that, yes, he was married to Joy, and yes, that, and so that's, they considered that as to be a falsehood. And it was the president and two deans that signed the letter indicating that he was, where you have magna cum laude, he was magna cum terpinatu, which is basically with great dishonor. So,
unfortunately.
And they finally recognized his graduate credentials in the 80s, if I remember correctly. But he wanted to do in the 40s and 50s, but he went to Columbia based on the fact that, you know, I can get a PhD in this, based on I was a Phi Beta Kappa at Oberlin. So his PhD work at Columbia, as well as here at Wayne State University, because he got two PhDs. A lot of people don't know that. So.
Wow, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your magnificent research, and God bless you for all of this, because it's obviously stories that we need to know. And because of their background, and Louis and Louisa, I have been able to be married and now legal in all 50 states. It wasn't when I first got married to my first husband, but God bless you for sharing these stories, because they're so rich and so important. And the tie between the East and West, as well as Black and white, is marvelous. And just thank you so much. And God bless you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I will tell you that it has been a labor of love for me, because originally when I started doing this work, it was on my parents, because they were here in Lansing, and it was everything that. And then all of a sudden I see this about Joy Earl, and I'm like, wait, I didn't know this about Joy. Well, let's see what else. And so I went deeper, and the deeper I got, the more confirmations I got. I mean, I didn't know that Joy Earl spoke at this church. I didn't know that Joy Earl spoke at this church. I had no idea that Joy Earl spoke at any church in Lansing at all. I had no idea that Joy Earl spoke about the Baha'i faith in Lansing at all. I had no knowledge of that at all. And that, you know, obviously was due to the fact that other people did not know that as well. I mean, Louis Gregory in Lansing in 1928, that's not in To Move the World. You've got her, it's as Gail Morrison says, he's in Illinois in May, the early part of May, and then in August, he's somewhere else. And so there, you know, who goes looking for Louis Gregory? And, you know, now that I found out that there's a distinct possibility that Louis Gregory was at Idlewild, that Black resort up north in northern Michigan, because it says in her book that he stayed in 1924 at a retreat in northern Michigan. Idlewild is closed now except for Saturdays, and their museum is closed for the entire part of 2021. And I'm on talking email specifically to see whether or not it's possible for me to go up and look at just the records of 1924, because that was supposedly the year that he was there, the summer that he was there. And my understanding was that he was a guest with W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, if that's true, so be it. If that's not true, if he's there, we'll at least ways find out. But if I find out that he was there, there's a better than 80 to 90% chance that he spoke about the faith to those believers in Idlewild in 1924. And that's not written anywhere. So,
how long has this wonderful research of yours been going on?
Well, I would like to say since 2016, the latter part of 2016, and it actually started with the letter that Lansing has, that was found in a paper bag in a basement. And the letter was March 27th, 1927, to the Baha'i Friends of Lansing, Michigan, signed Ethel Rosenberg with a subtext from The Guardian. So The Guardian wrote Lansing, Michigan as a response to their writing him March the 6th of 1927. So 3 weeks later, he speaks, as they speak there. Now, anybody that knows anything about nexus points in history, they'll know that March 27th was also the same day that The Guardian spoke to Bertha and Sadie Oglesby in Haifa with regard to how come there are no more Black believers in this, why can't the cause track? And so they told him specifically what was needed from him. And he had said at that point, well, I can do this, but you've got to have the Baha'is example. And they, up front said, we need something from you. And so everything that came from March to that area to where you see the Oglesby talk in the National Convention is a result of what happened during that time of their pilgrimage from March, it says, to April, because they were there for almost a month, in fact. So that's kind of where we, took this from. But like I said, so Lansing's history is so deep with respect to having a letter from the Guardian, or as a response to their letter. You're thinking to yourself, okay, now where was this in my life? Because I grew up as a Baha'i here, and no one told me anything about the Guardian having written a letter to Lansing, Michigan at all. So you're talking about all of this history. And so my suggestion to everyone that's still here on the call is, if you live somewhere and you've got, it says there's a Baha'i faith, one of the things we're talking about as historians is to find out who the first Baha'i was in your city, what they did, where they were from, and what their lives were like. And so this is kind of how we want to knit together the fabric of the Baha'i community, is to say, if this person was the first Baha'i in North Carolina, then we should know about it. This is the first person that's a Baha'i in Washington State, then we should know about it. If it's the first person that's a Baha'i in Oregon, the first person that was a Baha'i in Arizona, California, Texas, the like. Now, I'll pose this question. To my knowledge, what I found out is that Louis Gregory is listed in the census in 1920 as living in Texas. Now, I'm not sure as to how that worked out, but apparently Stephen Collins says, yes, I can see that works out. And I said, good, because I can't. But because of the prejudice that existed in Washington, D.C., the Gregorys had 3 homes in 5 years. They actually lived one place, it's terrible there. Another place, it was terrible there. Another place, it wasn't so good there either. So I've been documenting that with regard to, Louis Gregory, this pivotal point for me, from when he became a Baha'i to when he came to Lansing or came to Michigan. So there's Michigan studies involving that. So there are a lot of things that, Louis Gregory did in Michigan, but they still haven't been documented as well. I mean, one of them is like a phone call that happened. Yes, I know. You guys are all set. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, let me
Stephen, you have 2 hand raised.
I see them. And Hermione has had hers up for a long, long time. So we could perhaps take these last 2 questions very quickly, because we do have an assembly meeting that needs this Zoom room. So
I got you.
So Hermione, could
Thank you. I'm going to be brief. I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question that should be easy to answer. My comment is, in one of your previous presentations, I don't know if it was the first one that you gave here or the second one, but when you referenced Idlewild, it made me wonder whether or not when we did community outreach in Idlewild back in the 80s and visited the Black elders there in particular, it made me wonder if any of them had been the recipients of any of the teaching graces from Louis Gregory or whoever else might have gone there. Just, it made me wonder if there had been some previous connections, because we didn't really know who had taught the elders back whenever they were taught. So I'm just wondering about that, just curiously thinking about that. And the other thing is, could you expound just a little bit on the letter that you referenced that Helen Eggleston wrote?
Sure. Okay. The first thing is in answering your bit about Idlewild is that we will know more in 2022. That I can assure you of. And the second thing, Helen Eggleston wrote that letter in response to the fact that Lansing had two members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is in the United States come into their community, and there was no advanced publicity about either one of them, because Corinne True was on this caravan across Michigan, but Louis Gregory was kind of, moving his way from place to place, and someone had suggested that he should stop in Lansing. My guess is it was either Roy Wilhelm or Mrs. Martha Root, because of the fact that they had both been there. And it could have even been Corinne True, but she did not meet. It said he did not meet formally with the local spiritual assembly. He did have two meetings with people of color. She says that specifically. She says leading colored people, he had two meetings. Now, I've asked the NAACP for their records. I've asked the AME Church for their records. Neither one of them has been responsive to my requests, and I've requested them for over a year. Now, obviously, due to the pandemic, no one's going to necessarily look into whatever archival references they've got. And if you know anything about archives, they're the last people to be hired and the first people to be shown the door. So,
Well, thank you so much for that, Burton. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Hermione. Thank you for asking.
So, Dorcas,
as always, I appreciate this brilliant presentation, and I'm looking forward actually to the next installment, whenever that might be.
No problem.
Yes, my grandparents have a home up in Idlewild, and they were there. I have pictures of them and other people. So, and this is from years and years and years ago. So there may be some pictures that you may be interested in. That's all I wanted to share.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dorcas. I appreciate it. Like I said, a lot of people don't know all of that history of the people of Northern Michigan, and we had wondered specifically, what it was that Louis Gregory was attending. But I could see full well that if it was 1924 and it was Idlewild, yeah, he probably was invited there by W.E.B. Du Bois, because I know he was there frequently in the summertime.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, everyone, we're going to need to wrap up. Before we do so, though, here's a few quick announcements. Today's program has been recorded and posted to the YouTube channel entitled South DeKalb Baha'i Unity Center, where you can view it and invite others to view it as well. And for members of the Baha'i Faith, you are warmly encouraged to make a financial contribution to the South DeKalb Baha'i Fund, the Sandy Springs Baha'i Fund, and the National Baha'i Fund through the online contribution system at ocs.baha'i.us, or mail a check to the Baha'i Unity Center at 2370 Wesley Chapel Road, Decatur, Georgia, 30035. I want to give many thanks to everyone who made today's program possible. In particular, of course, our wonderful speaker, Mr. Burton Smith. Also, however, all of our volunteer readers, and of course, Barbara Hennix, who keeps this whole thing running, and of course, the spiritual assemblies of the Baha'is of South DeKalb and Sandy Springs, who are sponsoring all of this. And thanks to all of you who came and shared your time with us. I'm Stephen Boynton, and until the next time, stay safe and well. We're going to close with a closing prayer for the departed.
And anyone that would like to say it, they can say.
How about I go ahead and read one? Glory be to thee, O Lord my God. Abase not him whom thou hast exalted through the power of thine everlasting sovereignty, and remove not far from thee him whom thou hast caused into the tabernacle of thine eternity. Wilt thou cast away, O my God, him whom thou hast overshadowed with thy lordship? And wilt thou turn away from thee, O my desire, him to whom thou hast been a refuge? Canst thou degrade him whom thou hast uplifted, or forget him whom thou didst enable to remember thee? Glorified, immeasurably glorified art thou. Thou art adored in thy truth, and thee do we all verily worship. And thou art manifest in thy justice, and to thee do we all verily bear witness. Thou art in truth beloved in thy grace. No God is there but thee, the help in peril, the self-subsisting. So thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful to see you all here today. We hope to see you all again next week. Lauapa.
Lauapa, and thank you.
Lauapa, thank you.
Aloha.
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 Aloha, everyone.